Well, hello. How lovely to see you, and a really warm welcome to this session on Stories for Life. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emily. I work with the Green Economy Coalition, and we're a big network, a big global network of charities, of international organizations, small business alliances, trade unions, policy researchers. And we have hubs here in the UK, but we also have hubs in Uganda, South Africa, Brussels, Senegal, India, Caribbean, Peru, even Mongolia. So what connects us all? Well, we're focused as a network on the economics of sustainability. We see an economic system that is pre-designed to lead to the wrong outcomes. It measures the wrong stuff. It channels finance to harmful activities, and it concentrates capital rather than redistributing it. So unless we can change the economics, we're going to struggle to salvage what nature we have left, or ensure that no one is left behind. And just to be clear, for us here at the Green Economy Coalition, this isn't a tussle between left and right or state versus market. We are as excited by enterprise and innovation as we are around big government intervention. We're as interested in capital market reform as we are in human rights. So that's just a little bit about me and the Green Economy Coalition. But before I go into a little bit more information about this session, I would really encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat, your name, where you're based right now, and maybe what brought you to this session. So do meet each other in the chat while we're talking. So this session, well, for a few years now, a big question has been sort of plaguing us, which is, why does the hope of a better economic system, one that's more rooted in communities, one that restores nature, one that distributes capital more fairly, why does that economic system feel so remote, so unobtainable, and often quite unattractive? It feels sort of culturally and community sort of barren somehow, fields of solar panels or roads filled with, silent electric cars. So having worked in television in my previous life, I started to look around for stories that were making this transition feel more aspirational. Those stories that enabled us to sort of feel a new economy, hear it breathing. And I really struggled to find those stories. And I couldn't find those storytellers either. So here at the Green Economy Coalition, we teamed up with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and they're also with us here on the call. And then the brilliant humans of Dan and Paddy, who I'm about to introduce, and some of you already know. And we started on an adventure to see if we could figure out what it took to talk about an economic system in a different way, to make that transition, that different story about what an economy can do, feel more human, feel real, and feel ultimately sort of inspirational and aspirational. So that's the context for this work. And I'm now going to sort of hand you over to Dan, who's going to tell you a little bit more about Stories for Life as a journey, and he's going to invite you to come on board and to play with us.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. I can't see you, but I feel like I can sense you around the world. I can see you in the chats. So I'm Dan, and before I give you a bit more of the context behind this work, and then Paddy and I will, between us, get into the sort of nuts and bolts of it. I just thought it'd be quite in the spirit of Stories for Life. which is about a kind of a different kind of world, where we all sort of, liked each other, and we were all kind of like generous and cooperative, and we were sort of powered by empathy and wonder and awe and imagination. We thought we could just get a little bit into the zone by if you'd be up for a little experiment with me. So if we were in a room now and I could see you all, I'd be asking you to, if you'd like to just close your eyes. We could do a little meditation. So just trust me on this. Nothing weird is going to happen. Okay, but maybe just close your eyes. Okay, maybe just take a deep breath in and take a deep breath out. Take another deep breath in. Breathe out. And I want you to think about where you feel most happy, most content, most at ease. So have a little think where that is, what you might be doing. And just take that in, breathe it in. If there's any kind of smells or sounds, just sort of bring them in. Okay, and now I'd like you to come back into the room. You can open your eyes. Right, this is where the experiment starts, because I can't see you. So what I'd be asking you now is to raise your hand if the answer to these questions is where you were. But I'm going to ask you to use the chat function, right? So when I ask you where you were, if the place I'm saying is where you were, then just hit a message in the chat room so we know that's where you were. Okay, right. So that happy place. Who was at work? Can't see anyone in the chat room. Okay. Who was shopping? Who was out buying stuff? It's looking pretty tumbleweedy in the chat room. Who was on the internet? Scrolling. Anyone driving? Anyone in their car? Okay. Who was in bed? There's always somebody in bed, surely. Anyone in bed? There you go. Okay, who was, the artists. The artists are always at work, but that's different. Not many of us are those. Okay, who was with someone they love? There's a few. Okay, who was in nature? Who was outside in a natural context, a natural environment? Here we go. Here we go. Look at that. So this strikes me as sort of extraordinary that I've been asking this question to many people that I work with over the last decade. It's always the same. The majority of us our happy place is outside. It's in nature. It's with people we love. That's what makes us most happy. And it strikes me as kind of, almost tragic, really, that the things that make us the happiest and the places that make us the happiest that we cannot survive without are being rapidly destroyed, if you like, by a way of organizing ourselves, a way of being on this earth that destroys life and doesn't make us happy. And it's just it's an interesting tension, I think, to hold in when we do this work, that what is going on in our lives, that, the things that make us most happy, most content, are the things that often we're doing the least of, and the things that we're being distracted from most of the time by things that are actually contributing to, the downfall of these environments, of these places, of these ecosystems. So I'm going to state the obvious here. Our world is in crisis. You might have noticed. I'm so, when we first started pulling this work together in sort of 2019, and we started trying to figure out what was happening. It started to think, are these crises interconnected? They seem to be everywhere, and I think we can safely say, we're coming to the end of 2021. And it feels like these issues are just, we're surrounded by multiple issues. On a planetary level, we have our Earth systems, the very sort of vital organs of our planet, if you like, that have taken hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years to form, are beginning to unravel in just a few generations. And in parallel, we have these extraordinary inequalities that we see socially, as well as the sort of planetary issues, all of these human issues that are we're being confronted with, the divisiveness that we see also in our societies that are driving us. So, we have a multiple sort of sense of crises, which can be overwhelming and can feel overwhelming. And I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to sort of composting myself with the leaves as soon as possible, because this year has been quite intense. But it's an extraordinary time to be alive. And so I guess the work we've been doing with Emily and Green Economy Coalition and the Wellbeing Economy Alliance has been trying to explore what is it that's driving these, and what happens if the thing, I guess, is at the center of these crises was the design of our economy. So what if these crises are symptoms, if you like, which are caused by an economy which has been designed, if you like, with a way of understanding the world, which we now know to be hugely destructive to life. And it's important to say we now know, because again, all of this economic design, it's a couple of 100 years old, maybe. If we think about it, it was a design. And really now we understand that this design, which has been adopted pretty much globally, exploits the natural world and the marginalized to the point of collapse. And I think that's what's at the center of this work. And I guess what we're saying is, the question we'd like to field is, what if the stories that we tell ourselves every day, and the stories we live by every day, the stories we hear in our media, in our politics, in our culture, that we're given through our education, that we talk about through our social media platforms, what if these stories actually were a huge part of the problem? And so that's really what we've been exploring with Stories for Life. And as Emily said, what is it that's stopping the emergence of a different type of economy that puts human and ecological well-being at the front and center? And I guess when we explored this work, our initial thought was, well, what might be the role of kind of our creative cultures in helping to explore these shifts? How do we bring forth this transformation that's required around the way that we design our economies? So, as Emily said, we began asking a lot of questions end of 2019, speaking to all kinds of people all over the world. We were looking at kind of ideas, both very sort of ancient ideas and modern ideas. And I think that's what Stories for Life is very much trying to weave together, a huge amount of thinking and ideas that already exist and have existed, and bring them together. And we went through a stage of sort of prototyping and bringing different people together to kind of try to make sense of some of the ideas that were coming out of this. And then we got hit by COVID-19. Do you remember the first wave? It's 4.0 now, isn't it? It's kind of gone with this news area. It's like COVID 4.0, but COVID 1.0 back in whenever that was. It was early 2020, wasn't it? And we suddenly found ourselves kind of locked down with all of this learnings, all of these interviews, all of these kind of creative hacks we've been doing. And we were trying to make sense of what we'd found out. And could it be actually useful in a time where people were witnessing in the start of the pandemic? I think clearly people were starting to see how broken this economic design, this economic system was. And I think that was a bit of a reveal for I'm guessing a lot of people on this call have probably spent most of your time, underneath these issues, really understanding them. But for the majority of people in our cultures, this stuff is like, it's like on another planet most of the time. People aren't spending their time looking at what's an economy and how does it work. But I guess what the pandemic did, I think, was revealed to many more people how this system is not fit for purpose anymore. Not only it has no resilience in it. If you remember when we originally sort of went into lockdowns, I like to think of it like driving in fifth gear. Our economy, it's like it only really works if it's in fifth with the foot down. It sort of runs on extraction and energy and nature. It basically runs on nature, and it's powered by millions of people many of whom are working in terrible conditions, very vulnerable, with no meaningful support. And I think many of us started to understand that. Many more of us started to see that. It was being revealed in the last, in 2020, 2021. And I think then we we saw again in 2020 with, the George Floyd murder and the sort of resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And we started to understand, even many more of us started to see what many had seen for a long, long time, was that actually these systems are also built on terrible social, racial injustices and oppression that have been going on for hundreds of years. And our sort of dominant cultural stories and narratives have sort of missed that or hidden them almost. And so I think in many ways, as tragic and challenging as the last 2 years has been, it has in some ways accelerated this type of work, probably by about a decade. If you can imagine where we were in 2019 and where we are now, it's lifted the lid, I think, on the sort of brokenness of this design. So many people, I don't think, had really understood that. So in some ways, there's something has been happening. So Stories for Life, we pulled together a lot of learning, and Paddy's going to dig into the theory, I guess, our this kind of story design, narrative design theory that we are exploring with its link to the economic design. But just to say, it exists online. Some of you hopefully have come across it. Its first iteration. It's not a campaign. It's not a prescriptive solution. It's not a couple of white guys trying to sort of have a top-down solution. We know that doesn't work. It never did work. We're really convinced that the future economies are being already co-created. They must be diverse, abundant with different ideas. The sort of monoculture, if you like, of the sort of Western capitalism model is just no longer fit for purpose. It probably never was for most people. That we need to kind of accelerate these decentralized ways of organizing and designing these ultimately human systems, that we need to be honoring kind of places and place-based knowledge and communities and diverse indigenous cultures and economies that can span and bring together both ancient and modern wisdom, technologies, designs, different ways of being and knowing the world. And this is already happening. This is already happening. Everything is on the ground. You can see examples of the new economy sort of popping up everywhere. Solutions, policies, practices, different ways of organizing, and people participating in those processes, designing, building resilience, and bringing kind of life back, if you like, which I think is fundamental to this work. It's how do we bring life back? Because ultimately we have a planet which is where the ecosystems and Earth systems are collapsing, and where human health and well-being is clearly is really suffering. So it's not a prescriptive piece of work. It's an offering to people working with story. But what it does, the one thing we are sort of holding on to, I guess, or the one line we're holding with this work, is we're proposing a collective approach, and we're inviting a collective approach to this. And so what we've learned through this process, and obviously there are some extraordinary people who are working and have been working on narrative design and the use of story as a way to help shift system change. And many of those people are featured and referenced in this work. And I think what we have learned through this process is that the stories and narratives are the things that shape and inform the design of our human systems, like economies, like industries, like politics, like education systems. That's the way it works. So they are, in many ways, a powerful technology for change, stories. And I think the interesting thing with stories is that we all have the power to use them every day. So many of us, I think, are so frustrated with how there's sort of the slowness of systemic change, or the way that power works. But there's something interesting with story. And so I think what we're trying to say is, like, what might happen if we joined hands a bit more intentionally across our different networks, across our different organizations, and started to use our collective creativity and imaginations focused on evolving two very specific, deeply ingrained stories that we believe have been critical in informing the shape of our current economic design and our sort of globalized ways of organizing ourselves over the last couple of 100 years. And so I'm going to name those two stories, and Paddy will dig deeper into what sits beneath these and how we can start to think about how they actually play out. But they are two stories which together weave this narrative, if you like, of separation that says, we're humans are separate from nature, and we're separate from each other. And that story is really driving this destruction of the living world and the vast inequalities that most of us, much of humanity is experiencing. And so this story of our relationship with nature, which currently says, if you like, nature's over there, particularly in the global north I'm speaking to here, and sort of highly kind of, I use the word developed in inverted commas there, but, this idea that nature's over there, we're separate from it. It looks nice. It's a bit dangerous, the wilder stuff, other species, not as intelligent or as evolved as humans or as important. Or it's like, it's resources. It's resources for humans to use. We extract them and exploit it, manipulate it, control. That's the story of separation that is dominant. And the second story is this story of how we measure success in our cultures, which is currently measured really by productivity alone and accumulation. It says that's the main metric. That's how we judge our economic success at a national level, the madness of GDP. It's how we judge business success. It's how we judge often individual success in our cultures. It's all about, getting ahead, getting more, beating everyone. We're kind of born now into a culture which says, you're an individual and you must compete and get ahead with everyone else. It's in the way we're educated. It's in the ways that we go through the job progress, and it's the way we're led and encouraged to live. It's a very competitive thing, and actually it goes against the core sort of human qualities that have been crucial for our evolution as a species, like kindness and compassion and cooperation and creativity and community and diversity. They're sort of seen as soft, weak. They're not about success, So these two stories are the ones that we're particularly interested in Stories for Life, this relationship with nature and how we measure success. And so that's really what this work is focused on. And of course, there are many other stories and narratives that people are working on in brilliant ways that are also causing huge amounts of issues in our modern human world. But those two are at the heart of the Stories for Life work. They're also actually really intimately linked, because so if you watch like governments like in the UK, which is the only place I can really speak to from experience, but what you'll have is you'll see the politics and media and business talking about, well, we've got to increase productivity and we've got to ramp up the growth and build back better and all this stuff. But of course, productivity drives material accumulation. The more you want to grow, the more you want to increase productivity, the more energy, the more materials, the more resources you use, the more you start to bring down the very natural ecosystems that support all life, humans included. And so we're in this impossible thing where those two stories are completely entangled. And also that story is grinding down the human spirit, right? How many of us, how many people are suffering from this story of relentless get out, earn money, earn a living? It's this extraordinary thing. And of course, we're completely interdependent on these relationships with the more than human world. So it's weird if you think about it right now. We have like wild animals, right? Insects, birds, plants, soils, water, air, stable climate, the very things that create and sustain life for humans as well are dying because of some stories we tell ourselves about an economy. Because these were stories. That's what's informing the design of the economy. We see nature as separate from us. We continue to do it. So we'll get into this, but that's really what this work is about. And I guess the other thing of this story of separation, we look at COVID 4.0 now. as we destroy the natural world, we open up the spread of zoonotic disease, which is actually quite incredible how little has been talked about of that relationship. I don't know if you've noticed that, but in the 2.5 years of this pandemic, it barely gets mentioned about, what is that relationship between zoonotic disease and economic systems. So anyway, before I hand over to Paddy, I think just to say, where we've got to with this work with GEC and Wheel Alliance as well is this, because all life is interconnected, human health and the health of our planet they're intimately entangled. You can't have one without the other. So we can talk about improving human health, but if we're destroying the natural world as we're doing that, do you see what I mean? That they're completely dependent on each other. So there's something really interesting about this moving away from this story of separation, which Paddy will talk about in more detail. So if we could evolve those stories, of our relationship with nature, with each other, and how we measure success, and what would happen if creative cultures and those with the power to story and communicate across our cultures, what would happen if more of us stepped into that and started to explore how we could change, how we could evolve those stories together in our own ways, in our own expressions. So this is very, very important. This is not a prescriptive idea. This is about tons of diversity, but all working off evolving these stories of our relationship to the natural world and each other, and our relationship of what is success. And so that's really what this work is about. And I think, just to reiterate before I hand over to Paddy, it's like, there's something about these times. They're very uncertain. I'm sure most of you on the call, like me, I feel like, this year, right, it's just been madness. It's too much. We're overwhelmed with it all. We're living in such uncertain times. But if you think about it, if we could let go a bit of that, if we could sort of step into that uncertainty, and I think if the pandemic's done anything useful, right, it has helped us all acquaint with what uncertainty feels like, right? So in many ways, like what and who really matters. So in some ways, we've already started to let go of the story of separation, the illusion of certainty. We're already going down the path. So it's kind of like, what if this moment was actually a really exciting time for creativity and culture and commerce and design and activism? Because actually, when we're on the edges of what we know and what we understand to be true and what we don't know, actually, that's often where we're most creative, And I imagine our future ancestors and all our sort of future beings are maybe calling us into service right now. So I'm gonna let Paddy take over, but I'll just reiterate: everyone has a role to play here. That's the beauty of thinking about stories as a technology, right? You might be a business or a brand, you might be a citizen, you might be a designer, a writer, a journalist, you might have media. You might be a media owner, you might be an artist, a scientist, you might be a teacher, you might be a filmmaker, you could just be a parent, because we all tell stories every day. We decide every day which stories come out of our mouths, what we put on our social feeds, what we use in our communication channels, how we talk to our workplaces. We have multiple ways to communicate. So we decide the stories that we want to carry, the stories we want to live by, and the ones we want to call out and drop because they no longer serve us, because they no longer serve future life or other living beings, and they definitely don't serve the future. So, there's something about that that's powerful. And I'll leave it just here with that. Mary Heglar said this great thing. She said, we might be living in a horror movie right now, but we're the ones writing the script, and we're the ones who will decide how this movie will end. So on that, I'm going to hand you over to Paddy. I hope that gives you a bit of context, and you're still with us. So Paddy, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you on this, nearing the end of the year. Everyone's a bit exhausted. I certainly feel that way myself. It's interesting. I'm going to go through this, as Dan said, in a bit more detail, probably covering some ground that Dan's covered a bit already, but you might be familiar with this if you've seen us speak about this before. And hopefully many of you on the call won't have seen it before. I think it bears repeating. I was on the ground for COP26 for the whole of the 2 weeks. Dan, the previous slide's fine. And I've, what we're talking about here is very much definitely not in the center of that thinking yet. There are bits of it on the edges, but really the work needs to be done here to make sure that just at the very basic level, the understanding of what is driving this, what the goals are that are in the way of what we need to do here in terms of escaping these emerging crises, and the role that this kind of thinking about narrative, working with narrative and story can play in getting us there is really crucial. So bear with me for the repetition if you've seen it before, but welcome if you haven't. There is a bit of a northern western focus here, for sure, and Dan alluded to that. That is partly because that's where we began this, and that's where we're sort of naturally thinking about it. And going forward, this kind of thinking, this kind of approach needs to be regionalized and thought about it in lots of different cultural contexts. But there is also another part here, which is that that is where the major focus needs to lie for a lot of what we're talking about here. These converging crises are not India or China's fault, regardless of what other people might want us to believe. I'm going to go into a bit of detail here about how, as Dan said, the crises that we face are ultimately symptoms caused by our economy, a deadly economy that's maintained by an outdated narrative woven by harmful horror stories, but that it is just a design, so it can be redesigned, upgraded by helping a new narrative to replace the old, woven by healthy love stories. And this is a narrative that is already emerging. And if we can drop two particular horror stories, the one Dan's were talking about, and carry two love stories instead, then we can all help with this emergence, so that together we can redesign our economy as an economy in service to life and escape the converging crises. So yeah, Dan, on to the next slide. So yes, as Dan said, the economy is the root cause. I'm not an economist, be very clear about that. I used to think that economics was really boring. It was all about numbers. It wasn't for me at all. And that's actually part of the problem here. Most of us don't really know what the economy is or what it's for. We tend to assume it's a fixed machine based on laws or a pot full of money, when really it's neither of those things. And the meaning of the word actually is quite revealing here. So eco means household, and neme means manage. So economics literally means household management. And this is where we get eco from in terms of, eco-friendly. And that therefore literally means household friendly, which implies that anything that's not eco-friendly isn't household friendly, and reveals just how much that we've lost track of the fundamental function of our economy. So as these crises suggest, we're not managing our household properly. It is on fire, it is polluted, it is flooding, it is full of rubbish. The parents are fighting, and we are running out of food and water. One signal of this is that every year on Earth Overshoot Day, we mark the day when we globally run out of resources that we can replenish sustainably, i.e. keep using forever, and we start going into debt. So this year, that date was July 29th. So imagine if your household ran out of water midsummer. Or imagine if July 29th was the last time you could charge your phone before 2022, the last time you could eat or feed your family until the new year. That's effectively what happened. And most people really were not aware of that at all. We're not paying attention to that. We're not hearing that. And one way for people in general to think about the economy, maybe a way that's more helpful, more easy, is as a vehicle that takes us where we want to go. And presumably we would all want that vehicle to take us somewhere nice, somewhere we would want to be. But currently it is driving us off a cliff. We need 1.5 Earths to keep living like we are today with the current economic system. 5 if we all want to live like Americans. But there is only one Earth, as is fairly obvious. Mars is a wasteland, and getting to the nearest habitable planet, the other sort of Goldilocks planets out there, would take us 6,300 years if we got there at light speed. There is no planet B, regardless of what Bezos and co would like us to think. As economist Kate Raworth puts it, humanity's 21st century challenge is to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. Currently, our economic design is not doing that. It's not allowing us to do that. Incentivized to relentlessly accumulate stuff, as Dan was saying, convincing ourselves it will make us happy or high status, we are extracting and using more resources than we can replenish, and doing so in a way that only really benefits a tiny fraction, not just of humanity, but of all life. This is a terminal condition. If we eat more cookies and we put back in the jar will go empty. We are stealing food from our children and all future life. We are literally taking candy from babies. So we on the call, all of us here probably know all of this. But why is it happening? Well, in a large part, it's because of the stories we tell ourselves every day. And it may be that if you're on this call, this isn't quite as familiar territory as it might be to some of us. So we have been living, as Dan's been saying, according to a powerful belief that is sat at the heart of our economics, that we are separate from nature and each other, that nature is external to our economy, collateral damage, rather than the foundational source of all value. So we let our economy pollute, erode the soils, acidify the waters, cut down trees, raise the temperatures, and exterminate wildlife, meaning that 8 million people die every year from pollution alone, double all COVID deaths every single year. And our biodiversity is collapsing, the biodiversity that provides us with stability, our life support system, the life we need to live. This separation belief also encourages us to see ourselves as competitive individuals, separate from each other, battling it out, zero-sum world against other life. So we separate other people from their land and their cultures and their families. And the very qualities that have been crucial for our evolution, kindness, compassion, cooperation, empathy, diversity, creativity, care, and responsibility, are often seen as weak and inhibitors to success. For many of us, this feels wrong, but we feel powerless to stop it. We keep destroying nature, life, including our own, thinking that there is no alternative, thinking that our economics is based on fixed laws like physics, but it isn't. It's just a design, something that a few men came up with based on what they thought mattered at the time. The beauty of designs is that they can be redesigned, upgraded, and new economic designs are already out there, waiting to be picked up, like the donut that Kate Raworth has been working on. Designs for an economy in service to life rather than an economy that destroys life, including our own. We need to see and choose these designs, but we're not seeing them or choosing them at the moment, or at least not enough of us are. As the comms guru Annette Schenker-Osorio puts it, I'll see it when I believe it. If we keep believing the old nonsense that maintains this deadly economic system, then we'll never see the new designs. And this is why we need stories now. Down onto the next page. The stories aren't just frivolous entertainment. They are the coding that shapes what we believe, that shapes what we choose, who we are, the way we think, feel, and act every day. Stories of all kinds, in all forms, from our myths, legends, parables, and fairy tales, to our textbooks, blockbusters, taglines, and headlines. Stories shape our understanding of the world and the way we act in it, and therefore the world itself. Now, in this work, we're saying both story and narrative. They aren't interchangeable the way we see it. And we follow the advice of many others who practice this work and have done for a long time to see them as crucially different things. A story is a unit of narrative. So a bit like a cent to a dollar, or a tile to a mosaic, or a thread to a tapestry. Together, several stories weave a broader narrative that then forms the fabric of our reality, the reality about which new stories are then told, and so the cycle spins. As our friend and guest from our previous sessions, Ella Saltmarsh, puts it, narratives are the soil from which everything grows. So we need to be working at that level to effect change. We need to intervene at the level of stories and evolve them. And that's really, really crucial. Dan talks about stories as a technology that we can use. It's a technology that we have to use. If we don't use it, we're not going to get the change we need to see. So we need to stop weaving the narrative that encourages us to believe, Dan, next slide, that we are separate from nature and each other. This narrative of separation, which is maintaining this economy that destroys life. This narrative has deep roots in Western civilization, woven by the stories that we've been telling ourselves for hundreds of years, from Judeo-Christian stories through to early science and our culture today. But it's a narrative that simply holds no basis in reality. And this is a fact that's being made clear today by the latest science, from quantum physics and systems biology through to neuroscience and sociology, all of which are revealing that what we have been dismissing as woo-woo or hippie or backward understanding is in fact scientific fact, that we are deeply interconnected, entangled, that we don't exist, we coexist in a complex web of life. Dan, sorry, still on the previous slide. But our culture hasn't caught up to this science yet. And it's a bit like the Copernican revolution. So this is when Copernicus suggested that the sun was the center of the solar system, not the earth. It wasn't a new idea at the time. In fact, it was an ancient one that had been dismissed. But his book was banned, and his follower Galileo, who proved he was right, was arrested. And it took 100 years for their ideas to be accepted by the wider culture. We don't have 100 years this time. And it may be that we're at 40 or 50 years in, but we also don't have 40 or 50 years. Catching up to the science isn't easy because we've been coerced into believing that we are separated individuals, despite the very clear fact that individual is merely a point of view. Our point of view currently ends at ourselves, which we see as contained, walled off from everything else, from nature, which is out there. And yet, again, the facts suggest otherwise. There are more non-human cells in our bodies than human ones. In our gut, on our skin, are billions of organisms. And in fact, there are more organisms in one person's gut than there are stars in the galaxy. We are individuals, like a leaf on a tree is an individual. Beyond that, we are intimately entangled in the web of life, dependent on it. A web that we, as I say, depend on entirely for our survival. And this is made painfully clear by the fact that plankton in the ocean, those little tiny creatures, they provide 50 to 85% of our oxygen. And our economy has led to us reducing their population by 40% since 1950. It's like punching a big hole in our oxygen tank. World Ocean Day isn't just one day, it's really every day. But our economic design is hell-bent on destroying that ocean, on destroying the web of life. So it is hell-bent on destroying us. Again, we're not suggesting any of this, we're really just noticing it. Noticing the voices from all over the place whose quotes and work populate our website. Voices who point to an emergence or perhaps a re-emergence of a healthier narrative, one that can unravel and replace this false, harmful narrative of separation. And this is the next slide, the narrative of interconnection, that says that we are interconnected with nature and each other, a narrative of entanglement, of interbeing, of relationship. And this is emerging now, partly because of that science, the Western channel for truth, revealing it to us, partly because many of those who have carried it all along are screaming it now in desperation as their cultures are destroyed, and partly because, especially in the wake of COVID, people have had a moment to reflect and realize that what matters to us, matters to them, is a kinder, healthier, fairer, greener, more joyful, and more united world. A moment to realize that human and planetary health go hand in hand, and to deeply feel that acquiring stuff as consumers does not ultimately make us happy, but that acting together as an interconnected community to help and care for each other can. The opportunity you have now as storytellers is to hasten this emergence, to unravel the harmful narrative of separation, moving away from the economy designed to destroy life, and weaving instead this healthy narrative of interconnection that can help us design an economy in service to life. To do this, we see these two places to intervene at the level of stories, as Dan said. First, spotting and dropping what we call the horror stories that maintain the narrative of separation, the two. And second, at the same time, spotting and creating and carrying the love stories that can weave the narrative of interconnection. This is a two-loop process. People are familiar with that, hospicing the old, nourishing the new. As Dan mentioned, in this work, we have focused on two horror to love story evolutions to do with how we relate to nature and how we measure success. Two ultimately creative challenges that we hope can inspire all of our work in whatever it is that we do. So the first, next slide, Dan, is the harmful horror story that nature is our slave. And this was once declared literally by Francis Bacon, the godfather of the scientific method. We probably wouldn't say this exactly today, but the story's lasting power is revealed in our treatment of the natural world, where now only 4% of animals are wild, because we have enslaved the rest to do our bidding, trapped, often suffering in cages as our food machines. The pandemic we're still struggling with, as Dan was saying, reveals the danger with this. COVID-19 likely being the result of habitats being destroyed and animals being kept together in tightly packed cages, because we view them as commodities, failing to recognize that they are in fact our community. Because if we keep nature locked down, we will spawn viruses that mean we get locked down as well. Lock nature down, we lock ourselves down. Damage nature, and we damage ourselves, because we are nature. We are a part of it, not apart from it. Nature is you, me, your friends, your loved ones, their loved ones. Nature is, next slide, our family. This is the true story, the accurate story, and this is the healthy love story that we all need to tell. But our stories today are so often about an excess of nature, or dangerous nature, or threatening nature, nature that we need to capture, conquer, control, defeat, destroy. So it doesn't hit us that we have destroyed 60% of animal populations since ABBA first sang Money, Money, Money. Defeating nature is literally self-defeating. Nature is our family, not our slave, our community, not our commodities, our relatives, not our resources. If we don't love nature, we cannot love ourselves. If we don't protect it, we cannot protect ourselves. Destroy nature, and we destroy ourselves. The second harmful horror story, which goes hand in hand with the first, is the story that productivity alone leads to success. So productivity matters above all else, meaning that we prioritize GDP, gross domestic product, which is an appealing metric because it's so simple, one big number to rule them all, but deadly because it is too simple. The person who came up with it, Simon Kuznets, warned that it should never be used to measure the success of a whole nation, let alone a whole planet, because its simplicity means that it is indiscriminate, does not account for the true cost of our activity, the impact that we have on our household. And it doesn't punish bad behavior that destroys our ability to live. In fact, it often rewards it. Like creating pollution using fossil fuels counts twice towards GDP, because first you do the polluting, GDP, and then you clean it up afterwards, more GDP. The damage to nature and our health in the process does not matter. We do not pay that cost. A murder has $1 million to GDP. Guns, bombs, addictive drugs all add to GDP. This design literally values death more than life. Trees, which play that vital role in maintaining the web of life, the life we need to live, are worth more dead than alive, according to GDP. This is not true growth. It's not true profit, because it ignores the true costs. It is insane. And the leading Nobel Prize-winning economists like Banerjee and Duflo know it. GDP is supposed to be a measure of well-being, but given our household is on fire, flooding, polluted, full of rubbish, and running out of food and water, we seem to have lost sight of that. The original meaning of wealth, wele, is well-being. So if well-being is supposed to be the priority, then why don't we actually just make it the priority? How about we tell a healthy love story that well-being is success and orient ourselves around that? This isn't about getting rid of productivity altogether, of course, but making sure that we're focused on what matters, that we're focused on the health of our family in the smallest and broadest sense, that we prioritize ongoing, thriving, flourishing life, the life we need to live. So for both of these story evolutions, we've suggested a few examples of stories out in the world, in the work, a process that we hope you'll continue with us, that others are going to join in. There is so much to create here, but also already so much to share. And we hope that you'll find your own way to spot and drop the harmful horror stories and spot, create, and carry the healthy love stories in everything you do, in how you live, what you express, what you put into the world. And we've also, on the next page, suggested a range of related stories, because these shifts are not just literal, it's sort of various ways of expressing that. Stories like nature as a gift instead of nature as our property, and enough is enough instead of push it to the max. Again, all of which are intended really to just be creative jump-offs, alongside some more fundamental principle shifts on the next page, also built from those story shifts. Principles like long-term instead of short-term, or long time, as our colleague Alice Thotmarsh puts it, or belonging instead of isolation. And in our imagination section on the site, which archives some of the brilliant work and thinking that we've learned from and continue to learn from as we continue to do this work. So next slide, Dan. As we've been saying all along, this is just fundamentally an invitation and offer to notice what the many brilliant voices from across the map have noticed already, to continue the process we've begun here of dropping the horror and carrying the love, to ask questions like, how can our work encourage us to love and care for nature as our family? And how can our work help us to recognize the wealth in well-being? An invitation to begin evolving the stories that we tell every day. Because as we've discussed here, and in more detail on the site, the economy is the root cause of our crises. It is stupid, is disconnected from our science, wisdom, and common sense, a deadly design maintained by a harmful narrative of separation, but one that can be redesigned, guided by a healthy narrative of interconnection, which is emerging now to help us see the new designs already out there and choose them, an emergence that will need all of our power to evolve the stories that we tell every single day through all of the work we do and in all of our lives, into love stories about how nature is our family and well-being is success. If we can tell these stories for life, we can all play our part in designing an economy in service to life for all of our sakes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan and Paddy, for taking us on that journey again. It's a Every time I hear it, I feel a little bit more inspired. When I was thinking about what examples of story shaping narrative might be, actually, and I don't know whether anyone saw my octopus teacher, but you may have missed that as a result of that documentary, which recounts the relationship between a diver and an octopus, the UK government has now conducted an independent review by the London School of Economics, looking at 300 scientific case studies, and has found strong scientific evidence that sea creatures can feel pain, distress, and harm. And as a result, it's likely that we're going to see a new bill to include cephalopods as well as crustaceans in its animal welfare bill. So that's just a tiny example of one story actually shifting a sort of a bigger narrative of how connected we are to the natural world. I'm really interested. I'd be really keen to get some reactions from some of the people joining us today. So, particularly from those who are already working in communications and storytelling and this field of trying to explain sustainability in different ways, in ways that connect with real people and real lives. I'd love to turn first to Rosalind from the International Institute for Environment and Development. Ros, you're on the call, aren't you? And I'd be really interested. You've been working in communications for a long time, but you also come very much from working in the global south. So I'm interested whether this sort of framing provides some resonance, or what kind of practical recommendations you might have for how we evolve stories for life.
Thanks very much, Emily. Thanks, Dan and Paddy. That was really interesting. It did. I was struck, Dan, when you said, there's no one way of doing things, and a monoculture and mono-economies are sort of no longer fit for purpose. And I think one of the things at IIED that we're keen to think about is whose stories are heard. And, so we want different stories to be heard. Stories, for example, from Indigenous peoples who have generations of knowledge about the landscape in which they're living. They've nurtured that environment. They're aware of its cultural, spiritual significance, and its significance for their livelihoods and well-being. And they have huge amounts of knowledge to pass on to other people. And yet often they're not listened to. And that was one of the things at COP26, for example, and moving ahead to the biodiversity COP next year, is that, those voices need to be heard because they have masses of stories and knowledge to contribute for finding solutions. And then thinking again about what is the story, and another part of the work that I've been doing is around trying to convince finance ministries and economic specialists about the value of nature and measuring that value in a way that speaks to them and makes them realize not only what nature contributes to the economy, but also what it contributes to people's well-being, it's, to recreation, again, to cultural factors, and not only knowing what that value is, but being made more aware of what could be lost if nature is overused, exploited, and short-term sort of behavior is prioritized over longer-term solutions. And that actually, it was noticeable at a forum around that work recently. There was a real call for stronger stories to explain, how that could be put across, examples of where people could show sort of the human side of quite a kind of technical approach. But I think that brings me to the final reflection I had was sort of being aware of the context in which we tell stories, being aware of where the power of who we're trying to influence. Being aware of where power is held and who we're trying to influence means we have to think about the language in which we express stories. A story needs to resonate with people to be effective. And if it's told in the wrong language, it won't resonate and nothing will change. So particularly around the natural capital issue, we had to think about telling a story about nature in a way that economists would take interest and sit up and say, oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that is relevant to me. I need to take note of what's being said and think about it for my work. So I think whose story is heard, what the story is, and the language in which the story is told are three really key things. And I think colleagues and I have found that particularly in our work.
Thanks so much, Ros. I'm just going to come around to Donald Cameron as well, because Donald comes from a different world. Donald comes from, sort of more the ad and marketing world. And Donald, I'm interested to hear what your reflections are of the work.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, it is brilliant work. It's really thought-provoking. It really makes you realise how deep and ingrained these horror stories are. When they crop up in fables and idioms and what have you, and that's a big thing to fight against, which made me think of things that we can do on a longer term, which is thinking about the stories, new phrases, new idioms, new parables, and some of the shorter term things potentially, which is just as described there about getting the language right to speak to economics and financial decision makers, because I think that's where the short term wins are, if you like, where if we can get in there and speak to these people in the right language and show them what they're not currently getting, what they're missing, what they're not understanding, what their models don't show, don't reflect, and and what's going to be lost, obviously. That's that to me, that's a place where we should fight and operate now and get things moving as fast as we can there. And the brief, if you like, for better stories, runs in parallel, and undoubtedly that'll run for longer, because just in terms of the gestation of the stories and them coming to fruition and taking hold, etc. And then that also just gets me thinking about the quantity of stories and the diversity of stories. And while diversity of stories and variety are really important, because nature's full of variety, where and all people have got their own stories and their own particular way of telling stories or getting a point across that will resonate with their communities. There's the advertising part of me, as you mentioned, that thinks if there are some particular stories either that we need to battle against, push back against, or to promote, either the horror stories or the love stories, to basically brief specific pieces of work against them. If they are the pivotal stories of our time, then let's get people thinking about those specific ones and create pieces that address them specifically, and leave the organic development of a more diverse, richer set of stories to evolve naturally. But yeah, just that thought of be prescriptive about what where the battleground is, and put resources and effort into thinking about stories that that turn into artifacts like was that an octopus or a squid? Sorry. Things like that, where you can have something that becomes tangible, becomes real in a relatively short space of time. It's not going to take a decade for that story to get around everyone. But if it becomes a proper cultural artifact that can be shared and promoted, and that exemplifies, either something against the horror story or for the love story, I think, thinking about those two things, just the pace or the time frame, and then the organic development of diversity versus specific action briefs.
I love that. I love that idea of the next step for this work, or let's be focused with this work to identify the battleground that can turn these stories into artifacts. That feels a really strong direction. Now listen, I'm so sorry, we've run out of time, and I feel like we could have spent a lot more time talking to you all, and there's a lot more to be discussed. So I'm sorry that we ran out of time and over time. Just a sort of in terms of this work, so we are kind of an informal unit, a narrative unit. We bring together quite a lot of different skills in this unit, from the sort of commercial and strategy side to knowledge of very specific stories on the ground all over the world, to networks sort of globally rooted. And what we're striving to do is to keep that sort of inform that network, this unit together, so that we can become storytellers and support each other in becoming better storytellers. So our hope is that this work is going to continue to evolve. We do have a little video coming out just of this sort of theory of change that we will send round to you as soon as it's done. I'm one channel to this work. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance is the other channel to this work. But Dan and Paddy are the heartland of or the authors of Stories for Life so far, and so it's been their sort of creative journey that has helped it to get to this point. So we would just invite you to stay with us on this journey, and if you would like to come along to the next session when we'll be sort of taking it forward and continuing to learn from each other, we'd love to have you on board. So with that, I'm sorry that we've run out of time. Thank you for staying with us, and we'll be in touch for the next opportunity to come together again.